March 10, 1945, WWII sector. They said the mission would be simple. The high American command told me to only take photos, but then, I destroyed 40 German aircraft. Those words, though not yet true at dawn, already pressed against my ribs like a weight I couldn't name. I had repeated the order only photograph, and yet even as I spoke it, something in me knew the sky over the Ruhr would not let me return unchanged. Before sunrise, the field was still half asleep, tents shivering in the wind, silhouettes moving through the dim light with the slow determination of men who had learned to hide fear behind habit. Frost clung to the fuel drums, and the ground crunched under my boots as if the earth itself resisted waking. I reached the briefing tent with my hands already numb despite the gloves, the cold cutting through the leather as if it were thin paper. Inside, the lanterns swung gently, casting dull halos over the map spread across the table, towns, rail lines, suspected positions, all lines and contours trying to predict the chaos the enemy still held together in this dying winter of the war. My assignment was circled in red, a reconnaissance pass over the Ruhr industrial belt, tracking vehicle movement, and checking whether yesterday's smoke had cleared enough for proper imaging. The order was explicit: no engagement, no firing unless attacked. The P-47 could carry rockets and 50s, that made it a flying hammer, but today it was supposed to be nothing more than a camera platform. I said copied, and the word felt like iron in my throat, cold and heavy. Outside, the sky was a smear of gray pushing slowly toward blue. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, their breath rising in tail clouds as they checked every bolt, every line, every hinge on the jug. The P-47 crouched on its landing gear like a creature built for blunt force, yet beneath its wings hung nothing but the fuel drop tank and the K-5 camera controls. The lack of rockets felt wrong, like an exposed rib. I could already feel the stillness in my chest, the tension that came whenever I flew without the tools that made us more than prey. When I climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit, the seat's cold seeped straight through the flight suit. I snapped the harness tight and checked the camera switches, watching the needles twitch to life. The canopy slid forward with a muted groan, sealing me into a tiny universe of glass and gauges. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared awake, the vibration pulsing through my spine. For a moment, all I heard was that rhythm, the deep, confident heartbeat of a machine that had carried me through countless sorties. But today wasn't a strike mission. I reminded myself that I wasn't hunting, I was observing. I was supposed to watch, recur, and leave everything below untouched. The idea sounded simple, but simplicity rarely survived first contact with the Ruhr. That region had a way of changing intentions, bending them until the person who returned was not the one who had taken off. As I rolled onto the runway, the wind pushed lightly against the rudder, a warning whisper of the turbulence waiting above the clouds. The prop blur sharpened into a disc, and the aircraft surged forward. The tail lifted, the wheels loosened from the ground, and the earth fell away in a slow, steady drop until only the vast, pale morning sky surrounded me. The sun finally cracked the horizon, sending its first fragile light across the industrial wasteland ahead. Smoke from distant fires clung low over the valleys, drifting like a restless veil. The Ruhr was waking, and I was flying straight into its breath. I looked at the camera panel, at the switches that defined today's boundaries. My gloves hovered over them. The mission was simple. The order was clear. But something deep in my chest warned me, this sky would not tolerate simplicity for long. March 10, 1945, over the Ruhr. The climb out of the field felt heavier than usual, as though the P-47 itself questioned the wisdom of heading into that gray wall stretching across the horizon. The tank slung under the belly tugged at the aircraft, adding weight that made every movement feel a little slower, a little more deliberate. Beneath my right elbow, the panel for the K-5 camera blinked with steady readiness, its switches aligned for a mission I still wasn't sure I believed in. Only photos. The words lingered in my mind like frost that refused to melt. Clouds crawled low over the land, thick as old wool, and the cold bit at my fingertips through the gloves even as the cockpit heater struggled to keep pace. I remembered the briefing officer's attempt at reassurance, visibility improving, scattered patches, no forecasted storms, but the Ruhr did not obey forecasts. It wrote its own weather, blending smoke, fog, and the metallic tang of a wounded industrial heart into a single, shifting mass that swallowed everything. As I leveled off at altitude, the world below faded into a pale blur, the land reduced to patterns barely visible through the haze. The canopy rattled as wind scraped across it, and for a moment it felt as though I flew through nothing but glass and uncertainty. I checked the camera controls again, partly for procedure, partly for comfort. Power on, film advance armed, shutter indicator flicking with the regular pulse I had come to trust. Every click would mark another moment of duty fulfilled. But as the fog thickened, each click also felt like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. The engine droned steadily, the only voice in the vast gray silence. I trimmed the aircraft and pushed deeper into the murk, scanning for breaks in the cover. A reconnaissance run depended on patience, and patience was easier to find when the air wasn't alive with the suggestion of danger. Yet, even in that quiet, I sensed movement to flicker in the fog, a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. My pulse kicked once against my ribs, sharp as a warning. Nothing followed, just the ghost shapes of trees and factories, long since abandoned or pounded into rubble. Still, I could feel the tension cold tight inside me. I knew that region too well. There were hid things, convoys, under camo nets, flak guns disguised as debris, even entire workshops tucked into ravines the maps didn't bother to mark. Surprises were not rare here, they were routine. I dipped the nose gently and steadied the aircraft as the haze thinned for a heartbeat. The camera shutter snapped 3 frames timed, clean, automatic. I felt the faint vibration in my wrist as the mechanism advanced the film. It should have relaxed me. It didn't. The fog surged again, rising like a living thing. A smear of white swept across the canopy, and suddenly I was flying inside a world so dim and close that the sound of my own breath felt loud. I kept the wings level and eased the throttle forward slightly. Below me, the land was nothing but suggestion. Somewhere out there were roads carrying the last fuel German armor could scrounge, train lines feeding the pocketed defenses around the Ruhr's burning factories, hidden flak nests waiting for the next bomber wave. I was here to photograph them, to bring back proof that the enemy still fought with teeth sharpened by desperation. But behind that objective lurked something heavier and unease that had been growing inside me since the night before. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the hollowed-out look in the eyes of the ground crew who prepped my aircraft, or maybe it was the unspoken truth that reconnaissance flights never remain simple for long. A sudden slit opened in the fog, a wound in the sky, and through it I saw the dark blur of pine forest stretching toward the horizon. I banked gently, letting the jug slide toward that brief window of clarity. Light filtered in thin, fractured beams, enough to see the terrain below shift from industrial wasteland to dense woodland. It was a welcome sight, but it carried a hint of danger. Forests in wartime were never merely forests. Another burst of shutter clicks echo in the cockpit, steady and mechanical. The K-25 was recording everything: tree lines, clearings, broken paths winding through the undergrowth. Each frame a piece of the puzzle I was stitching together for men who relied on these images to survive the next day. As I pushed onward, the fog parted once more, revealing a stretch of land that felt wrong, to geometric, to deliberate, to carefully hidden. Something waited ahead. I didn't know what, but the air shifted, and with it, something deep inside me braced itself. The next photograph would change my mission forever. March 10, 1945. Approaching the clearing. The break in the fog widened just enough for the light to slip through, a thin ribbon of brightness tracing the tops of the pine trees like a cautious hand. I eased the P-47 lower, careful not to draw attention, though I doubted anyone on the ground could hear me through the blanket of cloud still clinging to the hills. The Ruhr lay somewhere behind me now, grumbling through smoke and broken chimneys, but ahead stretched a forest so dense it looked untouched by the war and illusion I stopped believing months ago. I steadied my breathing as I scanned the landscape. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Tight rows of evergreens, the occasional bare clearing where fallen branches gathered like bones, the dark soles still glistening from the previous night's frost. Then something shifted. A shape sharp, not natural, caught the corner of my eye. I banked slightly, pretending even to myself that it was just for another photograph, another sweep of terrain for the intelligence officers. The K-25 shutter snapped 3 rapid frames. What I saw through the lens in that instant made my stomach turn. Nestled between the trees, not large, not obvious, but unmistakably artificial as a rectangle of darker earth, too smooth to be natural, too straight to be anything but man-made. It was the kind of shape I had learned to fear, a mark left by purpose, not by nature. I dipped the wing further to get a better look. More frames fired, the camera doing its job even as my mind raced to catch up. Then, as the angle shifted, the truth broke through the camouflage like a whispered confession. Wings, not 1 or 2, rows, there, beneath nets strung so cleverly they stole the light, were the narrow, predatory silhouettes of Bf-109s and the broader, muscular outlines of FW-190s lined up like silent guardians waiting for dawn orders. Their painted crosses glimmered faintly under the mesh, shapes I had seen too many times through gunsights and smoke. Some had ladders still propped against their fuselages. Others had open canopies, with ground crew moving in hurried patterns around them. I felt my pulse surge into my throat. This wasn't a simple hidden refuel point or dispersal area. This was a fully functioning forward airstrip tucked into the forest, a place that wasn't on any of our maps, not in any of yesterday's reports. A secret wing waiting to rise into the morning sky. The oxygen mask felt suddenly too tight. I loosened the strap a fraction, but the pressure inside my chest didn't ease. Below, mechanics in gray coveralls rushed between the fighters, some carrying hoses, others cranking equipment, others waving signals at trucks parked under the trees. One of the trucks bore barrel C3 fuel, the lifeblood of those fighters. I could almost smell it through the canopy glass, sharp and bitter. The K-25 fired again. I hadn't meant to take that shot. My hand had moved on instinct, and the shutter froze another fragment of truth I wasn't ready to hold. The map they briefed me on this morning had nothing here. No runway, no dispersal zone, nothing but forest. But the ground told a different story, one carved by hands desperate to slow the Allied advance any way they could. A cold weight settled into my gut as the realization struck with full force. These fighters were not simply resting, they were being prepared, fueled, armed, set in line for a mission, and with the timing we had been told, with the bomber stream set to cross this region tomorrow, the purpose became painfully clear. If these aircraft took off at first light, they would rise straight into the paths of the B-26s and B-24s that relied on us on scouts like me to warn them of danger. I wasn't supposed to engage. The order was clear. I was just the eyes, nothing more. But as I watched the mechanics hurry around the fighters, as I saw the wings lined up like sharpened blades hidden among the trees, something inside me shifted. A tight, uneasy pressure spread through my chest, and I realized the fog hadn't caused a tremble in my hands. It was fear, and something else, something harder, heavier. The next decision would not wait. The forest, the fighters, the men below, they all held their breath. So did I. March 10, 1945. Above the hidden airfield, the forest slipped beneath my wings with an eerie calm, as if the world itself held still to see what I would do next. I tried to steady my breathing, but the cold air inside the mask pasted metallic, sharp against my tongue. The hidden airstrip lay below me like a secret whispered to loudly, fighters lined in careful rows, fuel trucks moving with purpose, crews hurrying through their routines. Nothing about it felt accidental. Nothing about it belonged to the quiet morning I'd been promised. I thumbed the radio switch. My voice came out thinner than I expected, carried on a breath that felt too tight. Recon flight over grid 7, disability good. Coverage clear. The words were deliberate, calm, almost detached. They were also a lie. Coverage wasn't clear. It was exactly the opposite, but protocol demanded something, and that was all I could bring myself to say. A faint crackle answered background static, no voice. Maybe the fog swallowed the signal. Maybe someone keyed the wrong setting back on the ground. Maybe they heard me, but didn't understand what hid below my altitude. Either way, the silence twisted into my ribs. I eased the throttle back a notch and descended under the pretense of improving camera angles. It was believable enough. Recon pilots often dipped lower for sharper detail. But even as I dropped altitude, part of me knew I wasn't doing this for the film. I was searching for clarity, of a different kind. The nets covering the aircraft fluttered in the breeze, revealing flashes of paint, bare metal, the sheen of fuel on wings. I counted at least a dozen fighters immediately, then more shapes further in, half shadow under the trees. I couldn't tell if they were being readied for takeoff or had just landed, but their presence told me everything I needed to know. This place existed for one reason, alone to strike. The camera shutter clicked rapidly as I swept past. Each frame was crisp, automatic, impartial. The machine didn't care about orders. It didn't care about LEDs above or below. It simply recorded. My fingers, on the other hand, hovered dangerously close to the rocket selector panel, even though I wasn't carrying rockets today. Habit, muscle memory. Or maybe something deeper, something born of months watching bombers limp home with holes torn through their wings, months of hearing names read after briefing, men lost because someone, somewhere, didn't see danger soon enough. A gust nudged the aircraft, and for a moment the altimeter needle twitched. It wasn't a real change, just turbulence, but it reminded me of the lie forming quietly in my mind, a little lower for a better shot. The kind of excuse that could justify descent someone might later question. The kind of lie that opened a door to decisions I wasn't authorized to make. I tightened my grip on the control stick. The order echoed through my headset, not from the radio but from memory-only photograph. No engagement, simple, rigid, uncompromising. Yet below me lay a threat no one expected, a formation capable of tearing through tomorrow's bomber streams with the precision and discipline the enemy still held, even now in the late hours of the war. Another shutter burst rattled through the cockpit, more evidence, more proof, more weight. Through the side of the canopy, I saw a mechanic down below glance upward, just a figure tiny, anonymous, probably unaware of the aircraft circling overhead. He raised an arm to shield his eyes from the weak sunlight reflecting off my canopy. For a brief second, our gazes met across hundreds of feet of air. I couldn't see his expression, but something in the smallness of that gesture unsettled me. These men weren't firing, they weren't scrambling, they were only working, preparing machines meant for harm, but not yet airborne. And I was the one intruding into their quiet urgency. I pulled the jug slightly higher, letting the trees slide away beneath me. The camera hummed, still eager, still impartial. Below, the airstrip lay revealed, vulnerable in its secrecy, waiting for a judgment only I knew was coming. The order clung to me like frost, only photograph. Yet, every second I spent above that clearing made the order feel thinner, stretched past breaking. I exhaled once, long and slow. The lie was already forming. The descent was already happening. Every path before me led to a choice I could no longer avoid. March 10, 1945. First strike. The moment the selector clicked under my glove, a tremor ran through my chest, part fear, part certainty. I had no permission to do what I was preparing for, no authority to make the choice tighten in like a fist inside me. That as the hidden airfield rolled beneath my wings, as the nets shimmered in the morning light and the mechanics moved with that urgent rhythm of men racing the clock, it became impossible to imagine flying home with nothing but photographs. Tomorrow, those Bf-109s and FW-190s would rise into the path of our bombers like teeth waiting for soft steel. I had seen it too many times. The formation scattered, engines smoking, gunners crying for help that never came in time. I had felt helpless then. I would not feel helpless now. The first pass had given me the angles I needed. The second would define everything that came after. I dipped the nose and pushed the throttle forward. The jug responded instantly, its weight turning into momentum, its deep roar vibrating through the cockpit floor. The trees rushed upward, the clearing widening, the lines of fighters sharpening into distinct shapes. For a split second I felt suspended between two worlds, the one I had been ordered to inhabit, and the one I was about to step into by force. Then the first pair of HVARs streaked from under my wings. Even with the canopy sealed, the launch thumped through my bones. The rockets screamed downward, bright trails slicing toward the cluster of C-3 fuel trucks tucked near the tree line. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. The trucks grew larger in the sight picture until the first warhead punched into metal and disappeared. The explosion bloomed upward like a flame trying to reach me. A blinding flash washed over the cockpit, and for an instant the entire clearing lit in violent white. Heat flared through the glass, as if a furnace door had swung open. The shockwave hammered the underside of the aircraft, rattling the canopy and punching the breath from my lungs. Then fire erupted across the clearing, fuel burst into wild chains of flame, leaping from truck to puddle to wingtip, racing along the ground like living serpents. Smoke surged upward in thick black waves, swallowing everything beneath it. Mechanics fled in every direction, tiny figures scattering into the tree line. Some dove behind crates, others simply ran without looking back. I climbed hard, heart pounding against the harness. There was no turning back now. Below me, two trucks burned like torches, flames curled around the folded wings of a 109, licking at its fuselage until the paint blistered and peeled. Another aircraft sat too close to the flames. I watched its canopy burst from the internal pressure, a small puff swallowed immediately by smoke. 40 seconds ago, this airfield had been quiet, functioning, alive. Now it writhed in fire. Part of me recoiled from what I had done. Another part, one sharpened by months of escort missions and bomber losses, knew this destruction might save hundreds of men tomorrow. That knowledge didn't comfort me, it simply stayed with me, heavy and cold as a shadow. I leveled out, breath trembling inside the mass. The first strike was complete, but the attack had only begun. March 10, 1945. The line of fire. Smoke still streamed behind me when I rolled the P-47 into a shallow descending turn, bringing the hidden runway back into view. The clearing had transformed into a storm of fire and motion, vehicles abandoned mid-path, men racing for cover, wings beginning to glow with spreading heat. Yet the bulk of the fighters remained intact, lined in rows like metal dominoes waiting for the next shove, and that shove would be mine. My hand slid to the trigger for the 50s, the familiar cold ridges resting under my fingertips. The guns were ready, fed with belts of rounds our ground crew had loaded with quiet, practiced hands hours earlier, never guessing I'd use them today. The hum of the engine deepened as I pushed the jug into a steep dive. The wind keened across the canopy, and the aircraft shuddered as if bracing itself. I aimed straight for the first row of fighters. The moment I squeezed the trigger, the guns erupted in that deep, tearing roar that filled the entire cockpit. Tracer lines spat forward in glowing arcs, reaching for the camouflaged wings below. The first round struck a canopy and shattered it instantly, fragments spinning like glassy birds in the air. The next burst stitched across fuselages, punching holes through aluminum skins, ripping into engines that coughed smoke before erupting into sparks. I pulled through, the ground rising fast, the trees rushing past in a blur. The P-47 thundered so low that pine needles bent in my wake. I leveled out and banked to begin another pass. Below, men dove beneath wings, scrambled into trenches, or sprinted blindly toward the trees. Some froze when the 50s tore across the ground near them, then threw themselves flat into wet soil. The airfield had become chaos, pure, smoke-filled chaos. The next pass came with even clearer targets. Flames from the exploded trucks had spread, catching the nets and casting a flickering glow over the remaining fighters. I pressed the trigger again. Gunfire thundered. Tracers slashed downward, hitting auxiliary tanks strapped beneath wings, and each tank that ruptured unleashed another blossom of fire. Metal buckled under the force of the rounds. Wings snapped. A propeller spun loose from its hub and skipped across the clearing like a giant coin. A 190's landing gear collapsed, dropping the aircraft onto its belly in a spray of sparks. I thought of the bombers RB-26s, RB-24s flying tomorrow in tight, vulnerable groups. I pictured their formations, the slow, steady hum of their engines, the crews who lived inside those metal shells. I knew their faces, their voices, their jokes before missions. I had seen too many of their aircraft return blackened and broken, so I kept firing. By the third pass, the clearing was a storm of smoke and metal. One of the aircraft I struck rolled slightly as fire took its wing route. Another simply crumpled. The line of fighters was no longer clean. It was shattered, ruptured, burning. The smell reached me even through the sealed canopy, burning rubber, scorched paint, the sharp bite of gasoline catching air. It was working. But the cost of what I was doing pressed against me like a tightening band. Smoke curled upward behind me as I pulled into a wide arc, the wings shivering in the rising heat, the trees blurred past beneath. The airstrip groaned under the weight of destruction, and I had not yet finished. March 10, 1945. The hangars break. When I leveled out above the treetops, the smoke had thickened into a black column rising directly beneath me. Flames licked the sky in orange ribbons, forcing their way past the pine branches with a desperate, angry hunger. But beyond that inferno, along the far edge of the clearing, stood the hangar's lawn, low silhouettes half hidden under nets and timber. Inside them, I knew, were more aircraft, tools, fuel, ammunition, everything the Luftwaffe needed to keep this hidden outpost alive. I tightened the turn and lined up with the largest hangar. Firelight flickered across its roof, reflecting off the warped sheets of corrugated metal like the surface of a disturbed lake. The wind buffeted the aircraft as I dove again, the jug's nose slicing through the smoke column. The smell inside the cockpit changed as burnt residue seeped through the vents, a reminder of what I had already done. At the bottom of the dive, I steadied the aim. The guns erupted once more. Rounds slammed into the hangar's front edge, peeling metal back in jagged curls. A panel folded inward, revealing a glimpse of the darkness inside, shapes under tarps, wings stacked close together, tools scattered near a workbench. My tracers ripped deeper, chewing through crates and fuel drums tucked behind them. A split second later, the hangar ignited. The explosion tore through the roof like a rising beast. The entire center section bulged upward before collapsing in a shower of blazing debris. The blast wave struck my aircraft mid-climb, rattling the frame and jolting the stick in my hand. I hit a pocket of turbulence, recovered the jug, and pulled into a shallow ascent. Below me, the hangar roared like its foundations were crying out. A plume of fire twisted upward, reflecting in the canopy. More explosions followed, larger, heavier, as something deep inside the structure cooked off. The roof buckled. One wall sagged outward. Flames spilled through the gaps, pouring across the clearing like molten waves. I blinked hard as heat shimmer blurred my vision. Smoke stung my eyes through the edges of the mask, and I felt sweat bead across my forehead despite the cold at altitude. I circled back, fighting the turbulence created by the rising heat. The second hangar waited below, half hidden under a web of netting. Men sprinted away from it, their forms flickering against the blaze behind them. Some ducked into the trees, others simply froze, caught between duty and the instinct to flee. My grip tightened. I pushed the nose down. The dive was faster this time, steeper, more violent. Air screamed across the canopy, rattling the rails. The ground rushed up at alarming speed, but my focus narrowed to the sight picture. The hangar, the netting, the darker shape inside that looked like another fighter being fueled. I held my breath, pressed the trigger. Gunfire ripped through the nets, slicing them apart. Sparks erupted where the round struck metal within. Fuel sprayed outward like a silver mist before igniting instantly in a bowling flash. The entire front of the hangar burst upward, sending sheets of burning debris tumbling across the clearing. I pulled up, the Judd groaning in protest, trees whipped by below the wingtips as I strained against gravity. The heat washed over the aircraft again, hot, heavy, alive. Behind me, the second hangar collapsed into itself, flames devouring the structure as though trying to erase every trace of what had once been hidden there. I steadied the aircraft and caught my breath. The camera switches still glowed on the panel. I wasn't done. The airfield wasn't silent yet. The fight still clawed at my heels, and I knew the next passes would pull me even deeper into the fire I had willingly created. March 10, 1945. The silence between calls. The fire I had started roared beneath me, swallowing the clearing in waves of smoke and orange fury. Yet the radio stayed dead. No voices, no reprimands, not even a burst of static to acknowledge my presence. The silence pressed against my ears harder than any nose could. Usually, in the thick of a fight, voices overlapped with orders, warnings, curses, and the clipped hum of men trying to control fear. But now, as the Jug climbed through a wall of smoke, I was an island cut off, alone, held aloft by nose and flame and instinct. I clicked the transmit switch again. Recon flight calling base. Do you read? Nothing. Just the hum of the engine and the distant crackle of flames licking wood and metal below. I tried a second frequency, then a third. Still nothing. Either the fog smothered the signal, or the ground station was out of range, or more likely they heard something they didn't understand and chose silence. I couldn't blame them. I barely understood my own heartbeat. The clearing vanished in the rising smoke, leaving only thin glimpses of burning fuselages and broken wings. I banked left, trying to find a cleaner angle where the haze thinned. The turbulence kicked at the P-47, buffeting the wings with hot, rising currents. The aircraft shivered each time I skimmed the upper edge of the thermal column. Then a flash of light below cut through the smoke. For an instant, I thought it was another explosion from the fuel trucks, but the next heartbeat revealed the truth. A 20mm gun crew had taken position behind sandbags partially concealed by a line of pine trunks. The muzzle glowed, then spat a chain of tracers upward, angry and fast. They rose toward me, a bright red line that cut through the haze like a spark dragged across dark paper. The first round missed my cockpit, by inches close enough that I felt the vibration through the fuselage. I jerked the stick left, hard. The Jug rolled, the wing nearly scraping the smoke column. More tracers zipped past, some streaking below my belly, others arcing over the canopy. The crew fired relentlessly, their rhythm steady, their aim desperate but improving. A few rounds struck the fuselage, sharp metallic thuds that shook the airframe. One rattled the armor plate behind my seat. Another carved a groove along the port wing, leaving a trail of bright silver where paint had been moments earlier. My breath tightened. I pushed the throttle forward, diving just enough to break their aim. The gun crew swiveled, trying to follow the aircraft's movement, but the smoke swallowed them from view. For a moment, the chaos dimmed. The tracers disappeared. The guns fell silent. But below me, the fire still raged, and the enemy still moved through the haze. I could sense them even when I couldn't see them. Crews scrambling for other guns, officers shouting orders, men pulling ammunition crates into new positions. They weren't giving up, they were preparing for a fight. I steadied my hands on the stick, forcing the tremor out of my fingers. The silence on the radio felt heavier than ever, a reminder that no one could guide me. No one could tell me to break off, no one could call me home. This was my battle, created by my choice, and I had no intention of leaving it unfinished. March 10, 1945. Crossfire rising. The forest tan smoke twisted beneath me as I turned back toward the clearing. The brief lull in gunfire gave me a moment to breathe, but only a moment. As I leveled off at a lower altitude, the ground erupted again in bright bursts. Another nest had come alive, its 20mm rounds stitching the air with merciless precision. A tracer shot past my left wingtip, so close I felt the shadow of its heat. I rolled right, dropping altitude, until the treetops whipped by barely 20 feet below. Needles tore free in my wake, flung upward like green sparks. I swung wide around the northern edge of the clearing, then climbed sharply to gain the angle I needed. As I crested the tree line, I spotted them. The new gun crew had set their weapon between two overturned trucks, using them as improvised shields. They fired nonstop, their tracers drawing a brutal arc toward the path they expected me to take. Smoke hung behind them like a curtain. I could almost see the determination in their posture, men fighting not out of loyalty to a shrinking regime, but because survival demanded it. I pushed the throttle to the gate and leveled my approach. The airframe trembled as speed climbed. The trees parted beneath me, the ground flattening into the clearing where aircraft lay shattered or burning in heaps of twisted metal. Flames cast wild shadows across the scene. The gun nest glowed faintly between the trucks. I squeezed the trigger. The .50 cal guns thundered in perfect unison, their recoil vibrating through the stick and into my shoulders. Tracer lines carved downward, ripping into the dirt behind the trucks, walking toward the gun's position. A spray of earth and splinters flew upward as rounds struck the truck frames. The shield of metal buckled, sparks flared. I adjusted slightly just a hair and the tracers found the gun. The weapon jerked, one of the men dove aside. Another stumbled backward. The entire nest vanished in a burst of dust and debris as the ammunition crate beside them ignited, sending shards of steel spinning into the air. The shockwave hit me mid-pass, rattling the jug again, but I didn't climb out yet. Another line of fighters waited at the far end of the clearing, maybe 10 of them. Some were already burning. Others sat untouched, still glistening under their netting. I swung low. The first aircraft caught fire as my rounds tore through its wing root. The next erupted when the bullets struck its exposed fuel line. A third collapsed inward, its engine coughing smoke before flames swallowed its cowling. The airstrip had become a graveyard of machines that moments earlier were ready to rise into the sky. But even as I banked away, another spray of tracers flashed upward from the far tree line. They were not done with me, and I was not done with them. March 10, 1945. The last rocket. The clearing rolled under me, a blur of smoke, broken metal, and frantic movement. I had done more damage than any reconnaissance pilot had a right to accomplish. But the airfield was not yet dead. Fires raged across the main taxi pads, but one line of fighters stuck deeper under the trees, tighter beneath their nets, remained mostly intact. They were the heart of the threat, the reserve meant to launch when the first wave took to the sky. And tucked among those wings, barely visible through the soot and chaos, was a fuel catch. If I hit that, the entire line would go up. I checked the panel. One rocket left. My breath steadied. The last rocket would decide whether tomorrow's bombers flew into a storm of German fighters or a sky cleared by fire. I pushed the jug into a tight climbing turn, circling wider than before so I could approach from the blind side of the guns. The smoke parted briefly, revealing the deeper section of the clearing. That tight cluster of fighters glimmered under their netting, shadows flickering across their wings as flames nearby reflected in the canopy glass. I rolled inverted, then dropped a nose into a near-vertical dive. Wine screamed around the cockpit. The P-47 shuddered as the speed climbed, its frame pushing against gravity's grip. The treetops expanded beneath me, dense, dark, reaching like grasping fingers. Through the haze, the target sharpened. I steadied the sight. The moment stretched. Then I pressed the release. The rocket leapt free, its tail flame a brief, brilliant flare and streaked downward in a perfect line toward the netted fighters. For a fraction of a second, I feared it might vanish into smoke and detonate uselessly against dirt. But it didn't. It struck the fuel barrel's dead center. The explosion that followed was different from the others, deeper, heavier, a rolling thunder that punched the air so hard I felt it through the stick. Fire raced outward in an enormous arc, catching fuselage after fuselage, wing after wing. The netting vaporized, bursting upward in flaming strands that danced through the smoke. One aircraft leapt sideways from the blast, its wing torn free. Another spun in place as the fire swallowed its engine. Flames spilled across the line, igniting each fighter in rapid succession until the entire reserve wing became a wall of burning steel. 40, maybe more, reduced to silhouettes of blackened ribs. I climbed sharply, the turbulence slamming against the jug's belly. Smoke twisted around the canopy. Heat shimmer blurred the world. For a moment, I wondered if the aircraft would clear the rising fire. Then the sky opened above me. I leveled out, breath shaking inside the mask. Below, the hidden airfield died in fire, and I could no longer pretend that I had simply photographed it. March 10, 1945. Frames of fire. The sky steadied around me as I gained altitude. The engine's steady growl, the only anchor keeping my thoughts from drifting into places I didn't want to face yet. Below, the airfield I had found by accident and destroyed by choice smoldered like a wound cut into the forest. Flames crawled along twisted wings and shattered fuselages, leaving glowing embers where proud machines once waited for takeoff. The smoke column stretched upward, blotting the sun in thick strokes of gray. And then the camera lights blinked on the panel. The K-25 had stayed armed through everything. The mission I had been assigned, the mission I had sworn to follow, waited patiently for me to return to it. Even now, as the fire clawed at the sky, the camera reminded me of the job I was supposed to complete. My hand trembled before I steadied it on the shutter lever. If I didn't bring back the photographs, none of this would make sense to anyone but me. I banked the jug into a slow, stable arc around the clearing. The air shimmered with heat, turbulent and uneven, jostling the aircraft each time the rising thermal waves struck the wings. But the camera needed clarity, evidence, the kind that spoke for itself even when the pilot didn't want to speak at all. I opened the shutter. The soft, rhythmic snap of the mechanism felt almost delicate compared to the violence still raging below. Frame after frame captured the ruin, burning hangars, collapsed beams, aircraft charged into unrecognizable hulks. Black streaks smeared across the forest floor. Trails of scorched earth marked where the flames had run wild. Even the treetops around the clearing glowed faintly, where sparks had leapt too high. Part of me wanted to look away, but I kept circling. Another pass, more frames. The camera clicked steadily, recording not just destruction, but the story behind it. Trucks overturned, tools scattered, ladders knocked aside by men who had fled seconds before the rocket struck. I zoomed slightly downward, adjusting trim to keep the image sharp. The fighters burned in line, some collapsed, some intact but blackened, some half swallowed by flames creeping through the clearing. I felt the weight of each photograph settle inside me like another stone. They weren't just proof, they were memory. Evidence of a moment when I chose action over obedience, fire over silence. They would outlast me, they would speak for me, and they would be impossible to argue with. As I arced back for one last sweep, the smoke parted enough for me to glimpse something unexpected. The faint outline of a man near the tree line, hunched low, watching the destruction from behind a stump. His uniform was smudged with soot, his posture stiff with fear or disbelief, I couldn't tell which. He didn't run, he didn't shoot. He simply watched the sky, as if trying to understand why a lone aircraft had turned a hidden sanctuary into a furnace. Another frame captured him before the smoke swallowed the view again. I didn't know why that image struck harder than the rest. Maybe because it reminded me that not every target wore wings. Some wore faces, some had names, some had dreams that had nothing to do with the war. But the camera didn't judge, it only recorded. I took the last series of shots, then shut the system down. The light flicked off, leaving the cockpit a little darker. The photographs would show the truth, but living with that truth would be my own burden to carry. March 10, 1945. Crossing the river, the jug trembled as I climbed away from the burning forest, the heat still clinging to the fuselage like the final touch of a departing storm. I glanced down one last time. The clearing had become a glowing wound hidden under smoke, the flames curling upward in slow, exhausted breaths. Somewhere inside that haze lay the 40 aircraft I had destroyed, and somewhere within me lay the weight of the decision that had changed everything. Fuel was low. I checked the gauge again, barely enough to get back across friendly lines if I managed the throttle carefully. The drop tank had been emptied early, and the main tank had burned faster than planned through the dives, the climbs, the frantic turns under fire. I trimmed the aircraft for maximum efficiency and turned west. Below me, the Ruhr unfolded in a haze of smoke and shadow. The factories still smoldered from recent raids, their chimneys leaning like tired soldiers. The river cut through the region like a dark ribbon, its cold waters reflecting the faint orange glow of the fires behind me. Crossing the river always felt like slipping from one world to another. On the east side lay danger flak, fighters, hidden airfields waiting to strike. On the west side lay home, or at least something resembling it. Tents, briefings, food that tasted like metal, but comforted all the same. Voices that called my name, hands that clapped my shoulder. A place where engines roared but did not threaten, where sleep sometimes found me. But today, the crossing felt different. As I approached the WWII, the horizon dimmed under a blanket of clouds. Turbulence rocked the aircraft, gentle at first, then rougher as the wind shifted. I fought to keep the jug level, coaxing it through pockets of cold air. My thoughts drifted to the debrief awaiting me, questions I wasn't ready to face, explanations I hadn't yet shaped into words. Why did you engage? Why didn't you call for permission? Why risk your life and your aircraft on a mission that was never meant for combat? I didn't know if I had the answers, not yet. The Rhine appeared beneath my wings, broad, dark, almost serene in its indifference. As I crossed it, a strange feeling washed over me. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter, heavier. The knowledge that I carried the truth in my camera and in my mind, and that soon, someone else would demand it from me. I glanced at the fuel gauge again. The needle trembled near the bottom. The field wasn't far now. Just a few more minutes of steady flying. A few more minutes to breathe. But behind me, the smoke column still stretched into the sky like an accusation, following my flight path all the way home. March 10, 1945. The green-walled room. I landed harder than I meant to. The wheels struck the runway with a jolt that rattled my teeth, and the jug rolled forward with uneven momentum until I coaxed it into a slow taxi. The engine sputtered once before I shut it down. When the propeller stopped spinning, the sudden silence felt unnatural, almost intrusive. Ground crew rushed toward the aircraft, their expressions shifting from relief to confusion the closer they came. The soot streaked along my fuselage told them enough to know something had happened, but not enough to understand what. I climbed down the ladder, legs stiff, gloves trembling around the handle of the camera canister. Someone asked how the mission went. Someone else pointed at the scorch marks on the wings. I answered nothing. I just walked, boots crunching over gravel, breath fogging the air. The intelligence building waited at the edge of the field, a squat structure with walls painted in a pale, sterile green that always made me feel like I'd stepped into a hospital for wounds no one could see. When I entered, the warmth of the stoves hit me first, followed by the scent of coffee and paper. The major sat behind a narrow table. His face didn't change when he saw me. He simply lifted a hand toward the chair opposite him, a gesture so small, so calm, that I felt my heartbeat trip over itself. In response, I placed the camera canister on the table. He didn't touch it yet. The order was clear, he said. A simple sentence, spoken without anger, without accusation, but it cut deeper than a shout ever could. I held his gaze. My hands shook despite the warmth of the room. There was a hidden airfield, I said, fully operational, fuel, crews, dozens of fighters. They were preparing for something tomorrow, maybe even today. If they had launched, I stopped, searching for the right words. Our bombers wouldn't have stood a chance. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any reprimand. I tapped the canister with a trembling finger. It's all there. Every frame. Everything I saw. Everything I did. Only then did he reach for it. He opened the container, pulled the film reels out, and examined them with clinical precision. His eyes moved slowly from frame to frame, the images catching the lamplight as he turned them. He said nothing for a long time. Too long. When he finally looked up, something unreadable lingered behind his expression, not approval, not condemnation, but a deep, unsettled thoughtfulness. You disobeyed a direct order, he said at last. I nodded. He stared at the film again, the glow of the burning airfield reflected in miniature across his glasses. Then he whispered, almost to himself, but you may have saved a great many lives. The words hung in the green-walled room, heavy as the smoke still clinging to my clothes. March 11, 1945. Between praise and punishment. The summons came before dawn, delivered by a runner who looked away when he spoke my name. I knew before stepping into headquarters that the verdict would not be simple. The major stood with two other officers, the air thick with attention I could almost taste. One read aloud the formal reprimand: severe violation of protocol, unauthorized engagement, endangering aircraft 10 mission integrity. Each phrase landed like a hammer on my chest. I kept my eyes forward, hands clasped behind my back. Then the tone shifted. Another officer held my photographs. The reels spread across the table like evidence of two different truths. He spoke of tomorrow's operations, of how the hidden airfield could have crippled our bomber groups, of how the destruction I caused had removed a threat no one else had even known existed. It felt strange hearing praise deliver in the same breath as punishment. In the end, they settled on both. A formal warning entered into my record, and an immediate assignment to guide a strike group tasked with hunting camouflage fields across the Ruhr. No congratulations. No commendation. Just new orders born from fire and guilt. I left the room knowing that in war, right and wrong rarely walk separate paths. March 12, 1945. Vs after lights out. That night, the base settled into its usual murmur, engines cooling, tents rustling, quiet footsteps in the dark. I lay on my cot staring at the canvas ceiling when I heard laughter drifting from the maintenance bay. Low, tired, but unmistakably relieved. The mechanic spoke about the strike I had made, about the 40 fighters that would never leave the ground. Fewer claws in the sky for our woes tomorrow, one said, tapping a wrench against his boot. Their words carried no malice, only the heart understanding of men who patch bullet holes for a living, but their relief did little to calm me. My mind kept returning to the men I had seen below, the ones running from the flames, the one standing at the tree line watching his world fall apart. They were part of a regime built on cruelty, yet as individuals, they were simply people caught in the same storm as us. The war had twisted all of us into shapes we barely recognized. I turned on my side, trying to quiet the noise inside my head. Victory meant survival, but survival came with shadows, and the shadows were louder than the laughter outside. March 24, 1945. Varsity and the Ruhr. When Operation Varsity began, the sky filled with more aircraft than I had ever seen at once. Transports, gliders, fighters, bombers, all moving in careful, powerful formation. The Rhine shimmered beneath them like a long, dark mirror. I flew escort on the outer edge of the convoy, watching the vast armada drift across into enemy territory. The radio buzzed with calm voices, steady and confident, but underneath their words I sensed the fear every man carried. Hours later, the reports came in. Our bombers had passed near the region where the hidden airfield once stood. Their losses were lower than expected, far lower. Some credited better planning, others the surprise of the operation, but a few quietly mentioned and the reconnaissance photos, the ruined fighters, the flames that had cleared a dangerous path days before. I didn't speak, I just listened as pilots shared their relief, their gratitude, their disbelief at how easily the Luftwaffe had broken that morning. They didn't know the details, they didn't need to. I kept my hands on the throttle, the ride behind me, and the weight of my choice resting exactly where it had been since that day over the forest. Victory had a taste, but it wasn't a sweet one. April 1, 1945. What remains? I write now because the memories refuse to stay quiet. The smoke from that hidden airfield still clings to my hands, no matter how many times I wash them. I can almost feel the heat on my face when I close my eyes the moment the first trucks ignited, the moment the hangars collapsed, the moment 40 fighters vanished in a single morning. People talk about victory as if it's a banner we carry, bright and clean. But victory is heavier than that. It smells of burned fuel and scorched metal. It echoes in the silence after the engines cool. The officers told me the strike crippled a Luftwaffe unit that might have torn into hundreds of our bomber crews. They called the action decisive, timely, even necessary, and maybe it was. The regime we fought was built on cruelty, its machinery designed to crush lives. Ending that machinery mattered. Stopping it mattered. I believe that. But I still remember the men running through the flames, the mechanic who paused at the tree line, staring upward in shock and fear. They were trapped in a system that twisted everyone it touched, victims, aggressors, anyone caught between duty and survival. I destroyed 40 aircraft that day, but the war left far more marks on me.